It's episode 100, and our guest this week, well, it's me. I'm Jeremy Cline, and this is Change Work Life. Hello and welcome to Change Work Life, the podcast that's all about beating the Sunday evening blues and enjoying Mondays again. And welcome to a very special episode 100. I can't tell you how delighted I am to have got to this milestone. And to celebrate, well, I'm doing something a little bit different this week. I have a guest on, as I usually do, but this time they're going to be the one asking me the questions. So I thought it was about time to share with you a little bit more about me, why I started the podcast and what I've learned from 100 episodes. But rather than me doing all the talking, I've asked my special guest to interview me. So I'm delighted to welcome Brendan Schneider to the show. Brendan is a marketing and communication professional in the private school space, and he's also the founder of Marcom, which is a community where they help each other do that type of work. And Brendan and I are also members of a mastermind group, which is how we met. We help each other out with a few other guys with our own business struggles. And so Brendan is extremely well placed to ask me lots of interesting questions. Brendan, welcome to the podcast.
Jeremy, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be part of your 100th episode.
Well, I'm very excited to have you. I'm also a little nervous, but, let's go straight into it. Brendan, over to you.
Let's go over. So you're handing the mic to me, and I want to jump right in. What was going on in your career that led you to think about starting something else?
This is probably quite a long story, actually. If I look back, I realized that I wasn't desperately happy with my chosen career path for quite a while, but I'd always been of the view, I was of the view for a very long time, that I was just kind of stuck in it. I mean, lawyer is a well-respected, good job, but there have been, a number of times where I've just thought, I'm not sure I'm really enjoying this. I mean, it wasn't awful. Bits of it are quite interesting work, and you do get to do some fairly interesting high profile stuff and meet some great people, but it just wasn't all that it just wasn't really rocking me. But I kind of felt like I was trapped in it, and I was like, well, okay, so maybe I'll just try and plug as much into my retirement savings and that kind of thing as I can. And then I randomly read an article which was about property investment. And it was about commercial property, and they were putting on some figures like what you could get in rent on a commercial property, like, not like this, fancy office block, but just like, a takeaway shop with a flat above it, an apartment above it. And it kind of made me think, oh, this is interesting. I suppose I was starting to think, I don't know, could this be an escape route? Well, possibly not an escape route, but it might be a means of sort of shortening the period between where I was and I guess you might say retirement, slowly building up, say, a portfolio of properties to generate a passive income, which might mean that I didn't need to work. So I started to research property and came across, a couple of podcasts, but the main one was one called the Property Podcast, which is still going. And they talk a lot about property investment, as you would expect for a podcast on that subject. But they also talk quite a lot around the kind of the business side of things, the mindset side of things, and they recommend some really interesting resources. So it was through that podcast that I first heard of the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, which is, a bit of a classic. And I read that and came up with some really interesting concepts. And then one of the hosts, a guy called Rob Dix, who I actually had the privilege of interviewing on my podcast, so episode 26, I think you can find my interview with him. He recommended a book called Unscripted by a guy called MJ DeMarco, who also wrote a book called Millionaire Fastlane. And I can't remember exactly what Rob Dix said, but something made me think, oh, that book sounds really interesting. I'm going to buy that. And it was an absolute eye-opener. I mean, it's probably the one book that has changed the course of where I've been going. It's quite ranty, it has to be said. And he starts off with a lot about why basically a job is just a silly thing to do, frankly. It's, he refers to it as the slow lane, and has lots of reasons about, lack of security and lack of freedom and that kind of thing. So it presents quite a case for why starting your own business is a really smart thing to do. But then the next section of the book it's kind of like a framework for what you should look for in a business. And it was just so well presented, the different characteristics that will put you in good stead for having, something that's successful. So I read that, and that was the book that made me start, okay, I want to look into this. I want to start my own thing. I had no idea what it was going to be at that stage, but that was the light bulb moment where I thought, yeah, I'm going to give this path a shot.
And that book was The Millionaire Fast Lane?
It was Unscripted.
Unscripted.
It's the second book he wrote. Millionaire Fast Lane came first. Unscripted deals with a lot of similar concepts, and I actually prefer it as a book. I read Millionaire Fast Lane afterwards, but yeah, Unscripted by MJ DeMarco.
Wonderful. I'm going to add that to my list. So now my question goes, how did you go from not being real, excited about the law, reading Unscripted, and then starting a podcast? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, that is also a very good question. I had various business ideas going through my head. So one of the key points from the book, and it's one that recurs, but it's that you don't look for ideas per se. You don't kind of think, oh yeah, this is a great idea, or this is a great idea. You look for problems. You look for pain points. So I started to look at what were problems or pain points in my life at the time. So to give you a couple of examples, when I was starting to think about this, my daughter was very young, like a year or something like that. And when it came to going on holiday or going on vacation, trying to find places that kind of check the boxes for what we needed for a 1-year-old was surprisingly difficult. I had a short laundry list, but it's things like, if you're booking a hotel room, could you hire a crib, for example? Did it have a bath rather than just a shower? Because it's really hard trying to wash a 1-year-old in a shower. It was things like that. And there were maybe, I don't know, half a dozen things. And we went on a couple of holidays, and it was always really, really difficult trying to find places which match these criteria. So I had this idea of, well, what about having that? What about having like effectively TripAdvisor, but for parents? So, you can list all the facilities that you need and match them up with these venues, and it's going to be anywhere in the world, and it's going to be this massive thing. So that was one idea I had. Another one, again, personal pain point. I have quite small feet, and in particular, they are quite narrow. And it is a pain trying to find shoes that fit. Almost always, it involves like getting insoles and heel grips and that kind of thing. It's a nuisance. And so I thought, well, is it just me? Could I start basically manufacturing shoes for people who are in a similar position? I even had a name. It was going to be Narrow Boots. So I don't know if you heard of narrow boats, which are like boats that go down canals. This was going to be Narrow Boots. So, I had the name and everything. And I started doing research into both of these ideas and kind of reaching out to people and stuff, and discounted both of those. But I mean, the hotel accommodation, child-friendly accommodation one was just going to be, when I thought about it, it would have been such a big project that would have required so much investment trying to get that I just thought, no, this is not the place for me to start. And so the other pain point that was going through my head at the time was, well, I'm not happy in my job. What about, I live in a town which is pretty entrepreneurial, actually. There's lots of people who kind of were in my position. They did the commute into London, did the office job, but then quit, and they've started a business. And we've got loads of independent businesses where I am. So that gave me the idea for a podcast, learning from these people, speaking to these people, finding out a bit about, why they made the change and how they did it, and find out what we can learn from them. And so I actually had a bit of coaching to try and get some of my thoughts in order. And the question that he asked that got me to the podcast was basically, pick one. Where are you going to start? Which is the one that sounds most interesting to you? And I thought, yeah, a podcast where I get to interview people. That sounds quite interesting. I thought at the time that, you can make money from a podcast. I'd heard of people like, is it John Lee Dumas? He talked about how he gets, these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of listeners, and you can monetize that. So I thought, yeah, okay, so there's a business idea there. And so I started the podcast, and I started preparing for it in about April 2019 and launched it in October 2019.
That's great. And now we're 100 episodes later, which is wonderful. That's a huge milestone. So I don't think I even said congratulations, because I know what a big deal that is. 100 is a lot. Now, when you started the podcast, did you have goals or expectations that you were hoping to achieve at some point in the future?
I had some very, very, very naive goals. I assumed that I, having no experience of podcasting, not having any audience or following whatsoever, would be able to go out there and get thousands of listeners. And I understood the CPM model. So, the idea that advertisers will pay you so much per 1,000 listeners. So I had that in mind as I was thinking, okay, so if I get to this kind of many thousand listeners, then I can generate that in advertising revenue. And I can make this into a thing. Oh, I was so naive. I hadn't realized. I mean, I don't know why I hadn't realized, but it is hard to build an audience. It really is. When you're starting from scratch, starting from zero, it's a reasonably broad niche, if you can have a broad niche. I mean, it's not like my podcast is about hair care for horses or something, something really specialized. I certainly have an avatar, someone I'm talking to, someone who looks quite a lot like me, midlife professional, partner, kids, mortgage, all that kind of thing. But it's still a sort of relatively broad niche. So trying to find where my audience was, where I could go to them and say, hey, come and listen to me. It was hard work. So, yeah, I mean, I'm looking back and realizing how naive I was. I'm actually really proud of the fact that I do have I've got to 100 episodes and that people are downloading and listening. I mean, it might be more in the low hundreds per week rather than the thousands. But yeah, certainly when I first started, I was kind of thinking, yeah, I would get these thousands and thousands of listeners. And then I guess once I had realized that wasn't going to happen, then I started thinking more in terms of, well, what can I do, first of all, to build the listenership, but then also to find out what businesses might follow on from the podcast. Because I started to recognize that a podcast of itself wasn't going to be a business. And so, yeah, I started to look at, well, what could I offer? And I've run a listener survey to give me some ideas about what the pain points are. And a lot of it was just going to see where it took me, really. And, one of the things it's taken me is to the mastermind group, which we have, which has been fabulous and unbelievably helpful. And yeah, it's just led me in. It's certainly opened lots of possibilities. You start to think that there's a lot of things out there that I could do with with some of the skills or some of the things or some of the connections that I've made.
Now, this is kind of meta because you're talking about changing careers. Your podcast is changing careers. So, and we're going through this. This is what our mastermind is involved with as well. Now, I think I know the answer to this, but are you working full-time as well as doing your podcast?
I took the decision that I was going to go part-time. So a couple of years ago, just before I started work on the podcast, I went down from 5 days a week to 3 days a week. I was in the fortunate position that financially there was enough coming in on 60% rather than 100% that we would, cover everything. That was actually really quite challenging, making that decision, because one of the things I recognized early on was that I was never going to have time to do this combined with working 5 days a week and having a young family. Weekends, I've got to be there to give my wife a break some of the time and, play with my daughter and that kind of stuff. And that was, time has always been a big challenge, but that was it. That was really in sharp focus. But again, it was a part of the coaching. We kind of worked through, well, what could I do? Could I take a period of unpaid leave? Could I, have like an extended holiday? To going into work and saying, hi guys, I want to cut my hours down. Is that okay? And probably without the coaching, I'm not sure I would have drummed up the courage to do that, but I did. And they said yes. And so that's what I've done. There were certainly some eyebrows raised. I don't think I'm the only male who's kind of like below retirement age who works less than 5 days a week. But in my company, I'm probably one of about 2.
Yeah. Well, I bring that up because you use the word courage. And, we talk about it in our mastermind. I have a side hustle, as it were, and I'm scared to death to make it my full-time gig. And I've always been impressed that you were able to do that and just go ask. So I think that's really important. And I wonder whether people that are listening, there's got to be some fear there, because I know I have it. And I, again, applaud you for doing that. Did it turn out the way you thought it was going to turn out? That going down, 60% and then doing this, or what lessons have you learned from that?
It's been interesting. I mean, yes, I can definitely do it. It certainly requires perhaps a bit more organization, perhaps a little bit more efficiency, actually on both sides, on the job side and on the podcast side. Mm-hmm. Truth be told, on the podcast side, certainly when I started out and I was literally doing everything by myself, I kind of quickly realized that it still wasn't enough. I mean, podcasting is a lot of fun and I've absolutely loved doing the interviews and everything. Yeah. But you do risk getting into a bit of a hamster wheel, especially if you're doing it all yourself, where you record the interviews and then you do the editing and then you do the show notes and then you do the posting and all that sort of stuff. And it was maybe about as few as 15 episodes in that I realized that I was, even just with 2 days a week, I was going to be stuck on this hamster wheel unless I created a bit more time. And so the way I've done that is to start to outsource some of the things that I do. So the first thing I outsourced was getting help with the transcripts that I put on the show notes page for each episode. So I could do a full transcript, and that's a bit of an effort to put together. Next thing I outsourced was the editing. So now I've got a guy who does the editing for me, and that all works out really well. I mean, I still listen to each episode to check that I'm happy with the edit, because buck stops with me, and also I quite enjoy listening to the interviews, and also I can make some notes for show notes and resources and that sort of stuff. But yeah, outsourced that, and then most recently I've outsourced the show notes themselves. So everything that goes on the web page for each episode, someone else helps me out with the sort of picking out the key points and that kind of thing. And it's one of these things I'm conscious it costs money to do, and as yet I'm not getting a return on that in terms of the podcast. But I mean, for one, it's good practice actually. I think if I want to succeed in business in any way, I need to be comfortable and be well practiced with outsourcing and delegating things. But also it was just kind of a necessity to be able to develop and build things up. And it's enabled me to streamline my processes a bit, such that I can get to the stage where I've built up a big bank of interviews and I can take some time out. So I can decide, hey, I'm going to take, we're recording this in July. So I have taken off June and July, apart from this, for doing interviews, because I've managed to build up a bank and I've got a slightly more streamlined process. But there's never enough time. There literally is never enough time.
Agreed. So you talked about some of the things that were probably challenging for you that you've outsourced. What have you enjoyed most about doing the podcast?
Definitely the interviews, which is a relief, because that was kind of when my coach said, so what's the thing that you want to start with? And I thought, yeah, interviewing people who made changes, that sounds interesting. The interviewing people has been absolutely fantastic. I absolutely love it. I mentioned that I listened back to each episode once it's been edited, and it's such a joy and a privilege not to listen to me necessarily, absolutely not to listen to me, but just to listen back to what my guests are saying. There's been so much value packed into those 100 episodes. Every guest has brought something, and part of me is a little frustrated that more people aren't listening, not because, not for my own reasons, but just because there's some brilliant content here that other people need to hear. Guys, this is going to help you. So yeah, I love talking to my guests. I love having them on. And yeah, I guess I just love meeting these random people. And, I'm at a stage where people are kind of pitching themselves to me, and some of the pitches are interesting and some of them aren't. But, I'm just having conversations with people from literally all over the globe on all manner of interesting subjects. And yeah, it's great. It's a huge amount of fun.
Now, I'm sure you've loved all of the interviews, Jeremy, but because I'm the host, I get to ask, what were some of your favorite interviews?
You might as well ask me which is my favorite child. Well, okay, I've only got one child, but which is my favorite children. I'll pick out a few. First one I'm going to mention it was my bonus episode, actually, or my second bonus episode. So obviously we're recording this, we're still in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic, and it was in March 2020 when here in the UK we went into full lockdown. It was really serious, and people were aware that economically this was going to do some serious damage. And obviously my podcast all being about careers and career change, that kind of thing, I wanted to put out an episode that addressed that. So I got a previous guest, Margaret Boy, who's kind of like an interview coach, onto the show to talk about what the effects might be and, what she was seeing in the job market in terms of recruitment. And it was unbelievably positive, actually. She was saying how, she was still seeing plenty of hiring going on. She also had a whole list of brilliant tips for how to prepare yourself and perform in a video interview. It was great to be able to put an episode out, relatively soon after that lockdown started that addressed this, and to have Margaret on, who gave just some great tips, some great inspiration, some great optimism as well. So that was one episode. Another one, it's got to be what I consider my highest profile guest so far. So I'm not into handicrafts in any way, but through my wife, really, I got into a TV program, which is quite popular here in the UK, called The Great British Sewing Bee, which is a sewing competition. It's very similar to Great British Bake Off in that people leave every week and, you end up with a final of 3, but it's all about sewing, making clothes instead. And I got really into it. And during 2020, it was the second series that I'd actually watched from start to finish. And one of the finalists in that series was a woman called Nicole Akong, who was a real character, a real ball of energy. And I think it's during the final or during the semi-final, they did a sort of, brief profile and talked about how she'd changed careers from financial services to starting her own jewelry house. And I thought, that sounds like an interesting career change. That sounds like it would be a good fit. And so I thought, well, I'll be amazed if I even get a reply to my email. But I emailed her, and then she said yes. And I nearly fell off my chair. I couldn't believe it. I mean, this was someone who had quite a following. As I say, she got to the final. She was a real character, and she said yes. And so I interviewed her in episode 53, and she really delivered. It was a really interesting story and lots of stuff about kind of mindset and how she approached starting a business. So it was a really, really interesting interview. And then, can I pick one more? One more favorite?
Absolutely. It ultimately is your show, Jeremy. So,
oh yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah. Episode 95, which is the first of my COVID stories series. So it's a short series. There'll have been, when this episode goes out, there'll have been 2 episodes go out, which all deal with how people's careers have changed as a direct result of the pandemic. And I have you to thank for it, because it was your suggestion, your idea to put this series together, which I have done. And so episode 95, I interviewed Chris Bryant, who started working in financial services. He was there for 20 odd years, and he hated it. And then he was off work with stress, due to go back to kind of start of 2020, and then the pandemic hit and he didn't go back. And so he started his own pizza business. His is the episode where I don't think I've ever nodded along with what my guest was saying quite as much as I have done with Chris. Just what he was saying about feeling trapped in his job and the lifestyle it presented and that kind of thing. He was, again, it was great. So I love all my guests, but there's 3 particular highlights.
I'll ask a follow-up question to this, but before I do that, I want to know what you've learned about yourself through doing the podcast. I'd love to hear that.
One thing I have definitely learned is that I can create something out of nothing, which is quite a good feeling. Yeah. I mean, I have literally, this podcast started with nothing, and I sourced all my first guests, and I learned how to do a podcast and everything that goes into it, which it turns out is quite a bit more than just interviewing people.
Yeah.
And I've built my own website from scratch. I was, never particularly techie. So building my own website using WordPress. So I didn't use one of these, website builders like Wix or Squarespace. So it's not like coding. I don't have to write HTML and CSS and all that kind of stuff, but it's still fairly technical. So I've created that. It's reinforced the idea that when I commit to doing something, I will stick to it. That there are a certain number of episodes which I understand are the number at which podcasters tend to kind of give up. So I think episode 7 is one of them. I think episode 11 is another one. Here I am, episode 100. So even though I've kind of, you don't get an awful lot of feedback with podcasting, so you don't get necessarily floods of people writing into you going, oh, this was such a great episode. But I've just thought this is going to be useful material. And over time, I'm going to have this great catalogue of resources. And so, yeah, I've learned that I've kind of got the, stubbornness to persist with this kind of thing. I guess I've learned that I think I'm quite good at asking questions. It's almost a game I play with myself. So listeners are going to have to watch out for this. But if I can get my guest to say, oh, that's a good question, then I kind of think, yes, so pleased with that. Yeah, I like it. I like asking questions and, synthesizing the information and that sort of stuff. So it's good fun.
Great. Well, the follow-up question is probably the more obvious one. Are there any important lessons or themes that have come up in your interviews?
Yeah. I'll pick out a couple. The first one is that you are not limited by your previous education or experience. I've interviewed lots of people who have gone on to do things which are completely unrelated to where they started. You've always got transferable skills, even if you don't necessarily see how they might relate to what you want to do. But the starting point, and I see this so often I'm quite regularly on discussion groups. I did my degree in blah, 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 and I've had 5 years experience doing blah, 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 and then I did another 5 years doing blah, blah, blah. What can I do? Answer: you can do anything. That experience isn't relevant. The real question is, what do you actually want to do? And then let's see what experience you've got that can help you, and otherwise how you can get there. Networking is a very, very common recurring theme. And I've always known that networking is important, but I've always thought of it, I suppose, more in terms of going to, drinks parties when we still went to drinks parties and trying to drum up business and that kind of thing. And it's so much more than that. Just talking to people, just building connections, just taking advantage of the opportunity to meet new people and being really open with having conversations with them. I mean, our mastermind, it's this network of 5 disparate people who we happen to have been brought together by a particular community that we're part of. But, I wouldn't have discovered you guys had I not put myself out there and put myself into this community. And, it's been absolutely invaluable. Some of my best guests have been referrals from other guests. I've had 2 or 3 guests who've supplied me with, between them, about 10 episodes worth, which is great. It's absolutely fantastic. So, networking, its power and how to do it as well. It's not some, sort of sleazy sales thing. It really is just talking to people, building connections, working out who you can help, making connections. Like, I introduced you to Stephanie because you kind of operate in a similar space. And I kind of thought, okay, Stephanie does something that, this is Stephanie Gayer, that she does something which kind of like Brendan does. Yeah. I'll introduce them. Nothing might come of it, but something might come of it. So that's, that kind of thing. I mentioned 2 more things. It's worth having a go. It's just worth having a go at something. Chances are it'll work out. There's been, guests who've said, I didn't think I was going to get it. I didn't think I was going to achieve it. I didn't think I had the qualifications. Sarah Turner, who's now a community nurse, she started as a sort of a PA and in marketing and events, and she phoned up the Open University saying, kind of interested in this, but not sure I've actually got the starting qualifications I need. And they said, oh, no, you're absolutely fine. And so, she gave it a go, even though she didn't think she was going to get there, asking herself, well, what really is the worst that can happen? Say if I do quit my job and try something else, well, what is the worst that can happen? I could probably go back to it. Okay, well, how bad is that really? So just having a go. And then a really interesting, I think, 4th one is the value of coaching, the value of having someone there to help you and to keep you accountable. Because what I've learned is that there's no shortage of material out there. I mean, there's my podcast, there's other podcasts, there's books, but it's very difficult to take all that information and synthesize it and figure out for yourself what is the answer. So coaching is brilliant for that. I'm really glad that I have been coached myself in the past, and also more recently, as we record, I'm still going through a coaching program to figure out what I do next. It's absolutely invaluable. It's not about there being a lack of information. It's the accountability, it's the hand-holding, it's the someone walking down the path with you and really helping you personally. It's that personalization, helping you personally figure out what you need to do.
That's great, Jeremy. And you just said, what's next? So I'm going to ask you, what's next? Now, I hope it's like episode 95 and you open up a pizza shop, but that might not be your thing. So what's on the horizon for Jeremy Cline?
So as we speak, I'm still going through the coaching process. And as I mentioned, I really like and enjoy asking questions and synthesizing stuff and connecting people. So I'm trying to figure out what I can take, which will lead to that. So it might be some kind of coaching or consulting. I haven't quite figured out what that's going to look like, and also where the podcast fits in with that as well. I mean, at the moment, I've got no plans to stop doing the podcast. I'm loving it, and, roll on the next 100 episodes. But is it then just going to be something which I do on the side because, it's something I've created and I want to keep it going? Or is it something that I can incorporate into whatever thing I start? So, yeah, there's still some work to do on that, but it's definitely giving me some ideas.
Well, Jeremy, I have two final thoughts. First is I hope to read the Change Work Life book very soon. So that's what I'm going to put out there for you. The other thing that I want to say, that if you're listening to this and you've made it this far, Jeremy knows I have a podcast that I've started and stopped and started and stopped. And the fact that he's made 100 is really impressive. So if you're listening now, I'm asking you to do a favor for Jeremy. I want you to go into your podcast app of choice and rate the podcast, please. It's a celebration for Jeremy for 100. Rate the podcast, write a review, and that'll help him because we need this to get out to more people. So Jeremy Cline, thank you for turning the dial or the mic around for me for episode 100. And I look forward to seeing you back at episode 200.
Well, Brendan, thank you so much for coming on the show and for interviewing me so skillfully. Okay, hope you enjoyed that interview with me. Big shout out to Brendan Schneider. I thought he did a great job, and I hope you enjoyed hearing a bit more about me and the journey I've been on over the past 100 episodes. I also really want to take the opportunity to thank you. Whether this is the first episode you've listened to, or if you've been with me from the start, this show just wouldn't be possible without you, so thank you so much for being with me and taking the time to listen to my podcast. As always, you'll find the show notes for this episode at changeworklife.com/100 for, of course, episode 100, where you'll find a summary of everything we talked about, a full transcript, and links to the resources which I mentioned. As I said in the interview, I'm not stopping yet, and I've got some great episodes coming up for the future, so if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to the show, and I can't wait to see you in next week's episode. Cheers. Bye.